You don't understand how the world works, Eliana, Ezra screamed, his tailored Tom Ford suit whipping violently against his frame. He backed her toward the unguarded ledge, his eyes wide with a terrifying, hollowed-out desperation. It's a math problem. 3 patients died, yes, but the merger saves 300,000. I cannot let you ruin this. Eliana stood her ground, the manila folder clutched to her chest. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She just looked at him with a chilling, absolute stillness. Murder isn't math, Ezra. Ezra lunged, his hands slammed into her chest. The city lights tilted violently upward, and Eliana plummeted into the dark. He thought he was killing a nurse. He had no idea what she really was. The emergency department of St. Jude Medical Center on a Friday night was a symphony of controlled chaos. It was a place of harsh fluorescent lighting, the rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors, and the sharp scent of isopropyl alcohol masking the metallic tang of blood. For Eliana, it was quiet. To the untrained eye, Eliana was just an exceptional triage nurse. She was 32, with dark hair tightly braided against her scalp, a demeanor that rarely fluctuated above a calm murmur, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. When a multi-car pileup flooded the ER at 10 p.m., the junior nurses panicked. Eliana didn't. She moved through the trauma bays with a fluid, terrifying efficiency. She didn't run. She glided, anticipating the needs of the trauma surgeons before they even opened their mouths. Vous fib, doctor. Julian Hayes called out, his voice tight with stress as he compressed the chest of a crushed motorcyclist. Julian was a brilliant surgeon, but he wore his heart on his sleeve. I need 1 milligram of epi. Push it now. Where is the... Already in? Doctor, Eliana said smoothly, stepping back from the IV line. Defibrillator is charged to 200 joules. Clear on your command. Julian blinked, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked at her, a fleeting moment of pure admiration cutting through the adrenaline of the room. Clear. The patient's body arched off the table. A beat passed. The monitor shifted from erratic static to a steady, heavy beep. 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 Sinus rhythm, Eliana confirmed, already writing the time on the whiteboard. Good work, Dr. Hayes. Couldn't do it without you, El. Julian let out a shaky breath, stripping his bloody gloves. Seriously, it's like you can see 5 seconds into the future. Where did you learn to stay so calm under fire? Eliana offered a small, polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I just don't like to rush. She left Julian in the trauma bay and walked toward the nurse's station. The truth was, she had seen worse. The flashing red lights of the ambulance bay were nothing compared to the blinding strobe of mortar fire in the Korangal Valley. The scent of antiseptic was a luxury compared to the smell of burning Humvees. Eliana had spent 8 years as a Tier 1 operator attached to a specialized naval special warfare unit. She was one of the few women to make it through the grueling selection process, operating in the shadows. But war takes its toll, and after her final deployment went horribly wrong, leaving her with a constellation of shrapnel scars across her ribs and a ghost in her memories, she had walked away. Nursing was supposed to be her penance. Healing, instead of breaking. She sat at the terminal, logging into the hospital's central database to finalize the trauma charts. As she typed, her peripheral vision caught a notification banner on the screen. It was a restricted file update for a patient who had died 2 days ago. Marcus Vance. Cause of death: heart failure. Eliana frowned. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She remembered Marcus Vance. He was a 40-year-old marathon runner admitted for a routine valve replacement. He was in perfect health. He shouldn't have died. And more importantly, he shouldn't have been flagged with the Archangel Protocol. The Archangel Protocol was the brainchild of Ezra Sterling, the hospital's charismatic, hyper-ambitious CEO. Ezra was a golden boy of the medical corporate world, currently orchestrating a multi-billion-dollar merger with a massive healthcare conglomerate. The protocol involved a new, proprietary line of synthetic heart valves that St. Jude was beta testing. Eliana's instincts, honed by years of tracking insurgents and identifying traps, flared to life. A cold prickle washed over her skin. She bypassed the standard security warnings, using a backdoor command she'd picked up from a cyber warfare specialist in Fallujah, and opened the raw telemetry data from Vance's surgery. The numbers didn't lie. Vance's heart didn't fail. The synthetic valve had fractured. It had shredded his aorta. She checked the other Archangel patients. 3 more deaths in the past month. all listed as complications, all valves fractured. He's covering it up, she realized, her jaw tightening. If the conglomerate finds out the proprietary tech is lethal, the merger dies. Ezra loses everything. Working late, Eliana? The voice was smooth, cultured, and carried a subtle weight of authority. Eliana minimized the window a fraction of a second before turning her chair. Ezra Sterling stood behind her. He wore a midnight blue suit that cost more than her annual salary. He was handsome, in a predatory sort of way, sharp jaw, perfectly coiffed hair, and eyes that assessed everyone as either a tool or an obstacle. Just finishing charts, Mr. Sterling, Eliana said, her voice perfectly level. Ezra stepped closer, leaning his hand on the back of her chair. The scent of expensive cologne washed over her. He glanced at the monitor, but the screen only showed a standard triage form. You're an asset to this hospital. Dr. Hayes speaks very highly of you. Says you have ice in your veins. I do my job. Indeed. Ezra's smile was thin. My IT department flagged a minor anomaly. Someone on this terminal accessed the restricted archives of the Archangel trials 3 minutes ago. A glitch, I'm sure. Eliana didn't break eye contact. She didn't swallow hard. She didn't shift her weight. She gave him nothing. Must be. The system has been buggy since the power surge on Tuesday. Ezra stared at her, searching for the micro-expressions of guilt or fear that normal people displayed. He found none. It unsettled him. I'm glad to hear it. Still, I value transparency. Why don't you come up to my office? We can look at the system logs together, ensure everything is functioning properly. It wasn't a request. Your office is locked down for the gala tonight, Eliana noted. Then meet me on the roof. The South Terrace, Ezra corrected, his voice dropping an octave. In 5 minutes. It's quiet there. We can talk without the chaos. He turned and walked away, his polished shoes clicking on the linoleum. Eliana sat in the glow of the monitor. She knew she should go to Julian, or call the police. But police needed proof, and Ezra could wipe the servers in seconds. She reached into the printer tray, folding the physical readouts of the telemetry data she had just printed, and slid them into the deep pocket of her scrubs. She stood up. Her heart rate was a steady, rhythmic 60 beats per minute. The south terrace of the hospital roof was a desolate expanse of gravel, massive humming HVAC units, and heavy shadows. The storm that had been threatening the city all day had finally broken, unleashing a biting, diagonal rain. Eliana pushed open the heavy metal fire door. The wind immediately tore at her scrubs, chilling her to the bone. She stepped out into the darkness, letting the door click shut behind her. Ezra was waiting by the far ledge, overlooking the glittering grid of the city. He turned as she approached, the rain plastering his expensive hair to his forehead. He looked less like a polished CEO and more like a cornered animal. You printed them, Ezra said over the roar of the wind. It wasn't a question. The security cameras in the ER caught you folding the paper. 4 people, Ezra, Eliana said, stopping 10 feet from him. She kept her stance bladed, her weight evenly distributed. 4 healthy people bled out on the table because your proprietary valves are defective, and you altered their medical records. They were terminal, Ezra shouted, taking a step forward. They were high-risk patients. Marcus Vance ran a marathon last month. You killed him. Ezra dragged a hand down his wet face. You don't understand the scale of what we're doing here. This merger, it brings an influx of $2 billion to this hospital. Do you know how many lives that money saves? We can build a new pediatric wing. We can fund cancer research for a decade. I am trading 4 lives to save thousands. You're saving your stock options, Eliana said coldly. And your legacy. I'm turning these files over to the medical board in the morning. Stop the trials, Ezra. Step down. Ezra stopped moving. The frantic energy seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a dark, chilling stillness. He looked past her, then down at the city lights far below. I offered Julian a promotion today, Ezra murmured, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Chief of surgery. He's quite fond of you, you know. He'd be devastated if you lost your job. I can give you $1 million, Eliana. Wired to an offshore account. You walk away. You start a new life. No. The word was absolute. Ezra looked at her, his eyes dead. I really wish you had taken the money. He moved faster than a man of his stature should have. It wasn't a calculated strike. It was a violent, desperate rush fueled by sheer panic and self-preservation. He closed the gap in 2 strides, his hands slamming violently into her chest. Eliana's tactical training recognized the threat a fraction of a second too late. She was standing too close to the unguarded ledge. The gravel slipped out from under her rubber-soled nursing shoes. The impact of his hands broke her center of gravity. She tipped backward. Ezra's face, contorted in a mask of ugly triumph and terror, vanished as the world flipped upside down. The wind became a deafening roar. The city lights blurred into streaks of neon. "I am falling," her brain registered. 4 stories. Panic is what kills you. Fear floods the brain with cortisol, freezing the motor functions. But Eliana didn't feel panic. The switch in her brain, the one that had kept her alive when her helicopter was shot down in the Hindu Kush, flipped. Time dilated. The world slowed to a crawl. She was falling down the side of the South Tower. She forced her eyes open against the biting rain. Below her wasn't the pavement. It was the setback of the lower parking structure. 3 stories down. Still a fatal drop if she hit the concrete. But between her and the concrete was the heavy steel rigging of a window-washing gantry, suspended by thick wire cables against the glass facade of the 3rd floor. Assess. React. Survive. Eliana violently twisted her torso midair, shifting her momentum. She reached out, extending her arms not to break her fall on the ground, but to intercept the rigging. She slammed into the steel guardrail of the gantry. The kinetic energy was catastrophic. The impact knocked the air from her lungs in a brutal rush. Her left arm hooked over the heavy steel railing, taking the entire weight of her falling body. A sickening pop echoed through her own skull as her left shoulder was violently wrenched from its socket. Searing, white-hot pain exploded down her side. Her grip slipped. Her legs dangled over the abyss. But her right hand shot out, her fingers locking onto the thick, greasy suspension cable with a grip like a steel vise. The gantry swayed violently, slamming her ribs against the glass window of the hospital. Above her, on the roof, she saw the silhouette of Ezra leaning over the ledge, looking down into the darkness. He couldn't see her hidden in the shadows of the 3rd-floor recess. He stayed there for 5 agonizing seconds, watching for a body on the pavement. Seeing nothing in the torrential rain, he stepped back and disappeared. Eliana hung there, 70 feet above the concrete, the storm raging around her. She couldn't breathe. Her left arm was useless, hanging at an unnatural angle. The pain was blinding, threatening to pull her into unconsciousness. She closed her eyes. She pictured the cold, dark water of San Diego Bay during Hell Week. She remembered the instructor screaming in her face while she treaded water with 100 pounds of gear. Control your breathing. You are the weapon. The body follows the mind. She took a sharp, agonizing breath in through her nose. 1. Exhaled slowly through her mouth. 2. She wasn't Nurse Eliana anymore. That woman had just died on the roof. She opened her eyes. They were cold, focused, and completely devoid of fear. She looked at her dislocated shoulder. She needed 2 arms to climb the cable to the maintenance hatch. Gritting her teeth, Eliana wedged her left wrist between the steel bars of the gantry railing. She braced her feet against the glass. She took a deep breath, squeezed her eyes shut, and threw her body weight violently to the right, the bone ground against the socket. A muffled, guttural scream tore from her throat, lost in the wind, as the shoulder snapped back into place with a sickening crunch. Tears of agony streamed down her face, mixing with the rain. But she could move her fingers. Eliana pulled herself up over the railing and onto the grated floor of the gantry. She lay there for 10 seconds, letting the pain wash over her, cataloging her injuries. Dislocated shoulder, reduced, 3 cracked ribs on the right side, laceration on her thigh. She reached into her wet scrubs. The folded manila envelope was still there. She looked up at the roof where Ezra had stood. "Math problem," she whispered to the wind. "Let's do some math." Ezra Sterling stepped into the private executive bathroom adjacent to his office. He locked the heavy oak door and leaned over the marble sink, turning the gold-plated faucet on full blast. The water rushed over the porcelain. He stared at himself in the mirror. He was shaking. His tailored suit was damp, his hair ruined. "I killed her." The thought echoed in his mind, shrill and terrifying. He had never committed an act of physical violence in his life. He was a man of boardrooms and spreadsheets. But as he looked at his reflection, the terror began to subside, replaced by a chilling, cold rationalization. She gave me no choice. She was going to destroy the hospital. She was going to destroy me. He splashed cold water on his face. He needed an alibi. The hospital's annual charity gala was currently in full swing in the atrium downstairs. He needed to be seen. He needed to go down there, smile, drink champagne, and wait for the police to find the tragic scene of a suicidal nurse who jumped from the roof. He dried his face with a plush towel, straightened his tie, and practiced his smile in the mirror. It looked rigid at first, but after a moment, the charming, untouchable CEO returned. "It's over," he told himself. "The threat is neutralized." 3 floors below, the threat was ripping the sleeve off her scrub top to use as a makeshift tourniquet. Eliana had forced the 3rd-floor maintenance window open with a metal pry bar she found on the gantry. She rolled over the sill and dropped into the dimly lit, sterile hallway of the hospital's disused east wing. It was under renovation, covered in plastic sheeting and drywall dust. She stood up, leaning heavily against the wall. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the pain was settling in like a heavy, suffocating blanket. She left a small smear of blood on the white drywall. She needed to patch herself up. And she needed a weapon. Moving with silent, practiced steps despite the agony in her ribs, Eliana navigated the empty corridors. She knew the hospital layout better than the architects. She bypassed the security cameras, sticking to the blind spot skills ingrained in her from infiltrating hostile compounds. She reached an overflow supply closet. It was locked with an electronic keypad. Eliana didn't have her badge, it was lost in the fall. She knelt, ignoring the screaming in her shoulder, and unscrewed the faceplate of the keypad with a dime from her pocket. She pulled the wiring harness, stripped 2 wires with her teeth, and crossed them. The lock clicked green. Inside, it smelled of bleach and fresh linens. She moved in the dark, her hands finding what she needed by memory and touch. Gauze, medical tape, a bottle of high-grade surgical antiseptic, and a surgical staple gun. She stripped off her ruined scrub top in the dim light filtering through the door crack. Her torso was a canvas of old war and fresh trauma. The puckered starburst scar of an IED fragment on her stomach. The long, jagged line of a knife wound on her collarbone from a close-quarters fight in a cobble alleyway. And now, the angry, purple swelling of her shoulder and the deep gash on her side from the gantry metal. She bit down hard on a rolled-up piece of gauze. She poured the raw antiseptic directly into the open laceration on her side. Her body seized. Her vision flashed white. She didn't make a sound. When the burning subsided to a dull roar, she took the surgical stapler. She pinched the edges of the wound together with her blood-slick fingers. Clack, clack, clack. 6 metal staples bit into her flesh, sealing the wound. She taped her cracked ribs tightly to restrict movement, then found a dark blue set of maintenance coveralls in a corner locker. She pulled them on, zipping them to the collar, hiding the blood and the bandages. She looked at the medical supplies. She bypassed the morphine and the Vicodin. Painkillers dulled the reaction time. Pain kept you awake. Pain kept you angry. From a surgical kit, she extracted a heavy, stainless steel bone saw and a scalpel. She slipped the scalpel into the breast pocket of the coveralls. Eliana exited the closet. She didn't head for the stairs to escape. She headed for the executive elevator banks. Ezra had tried to kill her. He had murdered 4 patients. She was not going to let him sip champagne and walk away. She was going to bring the war to him. Upstairs, Ezra stepped out of his office, adjusting his cuffs. He felt composed. He felt powerful. He walked down the carpeted hallway toward his private elevator, ready to descend to the gala. He pressed the call button. As he pulled his hand back, his eyes caught something on the brushed steel panel. Right next to the illuminated down button, perfectly centered, was a single, fresh, bloody thumbprint. Ezra's heart stopped. The air in his lungs turned to ice. He stared at the crimson whorls and ridges on the metal. The blood was still wet. It hadn't begun to coagulate. No, he thought, panic clawing up his throat, choking him. No. I watched her fall. I pushed her into nothing. The elevator bell dinged, loud and cheerful in the silent hallway. The steel doors began to slide open. Ezra took a slow, terrified step backward. The polished steel doors slid apart with a soft mechanical sigh, revealing the velvet-lined interior of the executive elevator. It was completely empty. No ghost. No bleeding nurse. just the ambient overhead lighting reflecting off the mirrors, projecting Ezra's pale, horrified face back at him. He stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, his eyes darting from the pristine carpeting inside the cab to the stark, undeniable smear of crimson on the exterior call button. He reached out with a trembling hand, stopping just millimeters from the print. He could smell the faint metallic tang of it. Someone else, his mind pleaded, desperate for a rational explanation. A surgeon, a careless lab tech. But no lab tech had clearance for the top floor, and no surgeon would press a button with hands covered in fresh blood. This was deliberate. This was a message. Ezra stumbled into the elevator, jabbing the button for the atrium level. As the car began its descent, the walls felt like they were closing in. He pulled out his phone, his thumb sliding over the screen until he found the contact labeled simply Silas. Silas Vance wasn't a mall cop. He was the head of corporate security for Street Jude, a former private military contractor who Ezra kept on a remarkably lucrative retainer to ensure the hospital's sensitive problems were handled quietly. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," Silas answered on the first ring. His voice was gravelly, completely devoid of inflection. "Silas," Ezra rasped, trying to control the tremor in his voice. "I need you to initiate a silent sweep of the building. We have an unauthorized presence. Location? Executive floors. The roof. Start at the top and work your way down. I think a nurse has suffered some sort of psychotic break." There was a brief pause on the line. "A nurse, sir? Do you have a name?" "Eliana," Ezra snapped. "Just find her. Do not alert the police. Do not disrupt the gala. Bring her to the sub-basement holding room." "Understood." The elevator chimed, announcing his arrival at the atrium. Ezra took a deep breath, smoothing his suit jacket. He pasted on his $1,000,000 smile as the doors opened, stepping out into a sea of silk, diamonds, and string quartet music. The charity gala was magnificent, a breathtaking display of wealth intended to woo the executives of the conglomerate he was desperately trying to merge with. Waiters circulated with crystal flutes of Dom Perignon. Ezra moved through the crowd, shaking hands, making empty small talk, his eyes constantly darting toward the security cameras nestled in the high corners of the room. Every time a waiter brushed past him, every time a shadow shifted on the grand staircase, his heart hammered against his ribs. He thought he was the predator in this hospital. He was slowly realizing he was the prey. Meanwhile, 3 floors above the gala, the prey was systematically dismantling Ezra's safety net. Eliana sat in the dark of a maintenance crawl space overlooking the main security hub. Below her, through the steel grating, she watched 2 technicians monitoring a wall of 50 screens. She knew she couldn't take on the entire security force. Not injured, not without weapons. She had to blind them first. She pulled a compact, ruggedized tablet from her pocket, a device she'd liberated from an IT cart she passed on the 4th floor. Her fingers flew across the glass. The hospital's firewalls were robust against external threats. But Ezra's fatal flaw was hubris. He allowed his internal network to remain streamlined for efficiency. Eliana didn't try to hack the mainframe. That would take too long. Instead, she targeted the HVAC automated control system, which ran on an older, unpatched subnet. Once inside, she bridged the gap to the closed-circuit camera array. She didn't turn the cameras off. That would instantly alert the guards. Instead, she initiated a subroutine that looped the last 10 minutes of footage on every single screen on the executive floors. To the men in the room below, the hallways looked perfectly clear, camera loop active. She whispered to herself. She slipped out of the crawl space and dropped silently into the corridor below, the rubber soles of her boots making no sound. The heavy maintenance coveralls hid the bandages, but every movement was a negotiation with the searing pain in her shoulder and ribs. She needed to get to the server room on the 7th floor to pull the raw, unedited Archangel data before Ezra could scrub it. But to get in, she needed a master keycard. And to get a master keycard, she needed to find someone who had one. She heard the heavy thud of tactical boots rounding the corner. It wasn't the rhythmic squeak of a standard hospital security guard. It was the synchronized heel-to-toe tread of a trained operator. Eliana pressed herself into the deep shadow of an alcove, her right hand sliding to the breast pocket of her coveralls, her fingers wrapping around the cold steel handle of the scalpel. Silas Vance stood on the south terrace of the roof, his tactical flashlight cutting through the driving rain. He swept the beam over the gravel, stopping at the edge where the stone had been kicked away. He knelt, running a gloved hand over the wet ledge. He leaned over, shining the light down the side of the building. The beam caught the steel rigging of the window-washing gantry 3 floors down. Silas zoomed the beam in. There, snagged on a jagged piece of steel near the railing, was a scrap of blue fabric, a torn piece of a scrub top. She went over, Silas murmured into his radio, his eyes narrowing. But she didn't hit the ground. She caught the gantry on the 3rd floor setback. Is she dead? Ezra's voice crackled frantically over the earpiece. Nobody takes a 4-story drop onto steel grating and walks away, Mr. Sterling. But there's no body on the deck. I'm moving to the 3rd floor. Silas turned to his 2 men, both heavily armed and looking decidedly uneasy. She's inside, probably crawling away with a broken spine. Find the blood trail. As Silas descended the stairwell, he pulled out his encrypted tablet and pulled up the personnel file for the nurse Ezra had named, Eliana Davis. He scrolled past her glowing nursing reviews and spotless attendance record, digging into her background check. He frowned. Her employment history prior to nursing school was listed as a generic administrative role for the Department of the Navy. Silas tapped into a backdoor database he maintained from his contractor days, running her social security number through a deeper military registry. The screen flashed red. File classified. Clearance level, top secret, PSI required. Subject: Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Status: inactive. Specialty: reconnaissance. CQB: demolitions. Silas stopped dead on the 4th floor landing. The blood drained from his face. Naval Special Warfare Development Group. DevGru. SEAL Team 6. Mr. Sterling, Silas said into his radio, his voice suddenly stripped of its professional calm. We have a massive problem. The nurse. Static hissed in his ear. Mr. Sterling? Do you copy? More static. A high-pitched whine signaled that the local radio repeater had been manually jammed. Stay sharp, Silas barked at his men, drawing his sidearm. She's not a nurse. She's Tier 1. Weapons free. Shoot on sight. On the 6th floor, Eliana had already moved. She had jammed the radios using a localized pulse from the radiology wing's localized frequencies. It wouldn't hold them forever, but it isolated the search teams. She found her target pacing the corridor outside the executive lounge. A heavily built security guard holding a suppressed submachine gun. He was tense, sweeping his muzzle back and forth. Eliana didn't wait for him to turn. She moved like a phantom. She stepped out from the blind spot behind a heavy marble pillar. She crossed the 15 feet of open space in 2 silent, explosive strides. Before the guard could even process the blur in his peripheral vision, Eliana's right arm wrapped around his throat like a steel cable, applying a flawless rear-naked choke. She dropped her weight, pulling him backward off his center of balance. The man kicked and thrashed, his hands clawing at her arm, but her grip was unbreakable. She avoided the surgical staples in her side, letting her legs do the work. 7 seconds. That was all it took to sever the blood flow to the brain via the carotid arteries. The guard's eyes rolled back, and his body went entirely limp. She lowered him silently to the carpet, stripping his tactical vest, his radio, and his master keycard. She didn't take the gun. Guns were loud, and they ran out of bullets. She preferred tools that didn't miss. She swiped the MasterCard on the stairwell door. Beep. Green light. She was 1 floor away from the servers. Down in the atrium, Ezra was sweating through his suit. The string quartet was playing a lively Mozart piece, but all he could hear was the deafening silence from his earpiece. Silas wasn't answering. Ezra, darling, you look pale. He snapped to attention. Standing before him was Eleanor Vance, the CEO of the conglomerate he was trying to merge with. She was a shrewd, sharp-eyed woman who didn't miss a thing. I'm perfectly fine, Eleanor. Ezra lied smoothly, forcing a laugh. Just the excitement of the evening. Well, it's about time for your speech. The board is eager to hear about this revolutionary Archangel protocol. Ezra swallowed hard. Of course. Right away. He walked toward the podium at the front of the room, the stage lights blinding him. He stepped up to the microphone, looking out at the sea of wealthy faces. He tapped the mic. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight, Ezra began, his voice projecting through the massive speakers. Tonight, we stand on the precipice of a new era in medicine. The Archangel Protocol is, he trailed off. At the back of the room, On the massive 100-inch digital donor display board, the hospital's logo flickered. It vanished, replaced by a stark, black screen with plain white text. The text wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a live feed of an EKG monitor. A flat line. Beneath the flat line, words began to type themselves out, letter by letter, in real time. Marcus Vance, age 40. Murdered by Ezra Sterling. The Archangel valves are lethal. The dead don't bleed, but I do. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. Eleanor Vance dropped her champagne flute. It shattered on the marble floor. Ezra stared at the screen, his world crumbling into ash. She wasn't just surviving. She was burning his empire to the ground in front of an audience. Panic erupted in the atrium. Donors murmured in confusion, pointing at the massive screen. Reporters invited to cover the charity event instantly raised their cameras, flashes popping in a blinding staccato aimed at Ezra's frozen, horrified face. "Turn it off!" Ezra screamed, abandoning the microphone and waving frantically at the AV technicians in the balcony. "Cut the power to the screens, now!" The screens abruptly went black, but the damage was irreversible. The whispers in the room had morphed into a demanding roar. Eleanor Vance was already dialing her legal team on her cell phone, her eyes locked on Ezra with the venomous glare of a woman who realized she had almost bought a poisoned well. Ezra didn't wait. He bolted off the stage, pushing past bewildered guests, and sprinted toward the private service elevators. He had to get to the server room. If Eliana got the raw data out to the press, he wasn't just looking at a ruined merger. He was looking at life in federal prison. On the 7th floor, the heavy steel door to the server farm stood open. Silas and his remaining guard arrived, guns drawn, sweeping the dim, blue-lit aisles of humming data racks. The air conditioning in the room was aggressive, keeping the servers cool, but Silas was sweating. "Check the main terminal," Silas ordered his man. The guard moved cautiously down the center aisle. He reached the primary console. "Sir, the terminal is active. A massive data transfer just completed. Sent to an external, heavily encrypted cloud drop, and she initiated a secure wipe of the local drives." Silas cursed violently. "Where is she?" "She couldn't have gotten far." "I'm right here." The voice was terrifyingly calm. It didn't come from the doorway. It came from above. Silas looked up just as the heavy, metal-cased ventilation grate above them was kicked free. Eliana dropped from the ceiling like a stone. She landed squarely on the shoulders of the second guard, using her momentum and her heavy boots to drive him straight to the floor. The sickening crunch of his collarbone snapping echoed over the hum of the servers. Silas spun, bringing his weapon to bear. He didn't have a clear shot. Eliana rolled gracefully off the downed man, ignoring the flare of agony in her ribs, and vanished behind a row of server racks. "I know what you are, Davis," Silas yelled, tracking his gun along the aisles. "Dev grew. Pretty impressive resume for a triage nurse. But you're bleeding. You're hurt. And you are trapped." "I'm not trapped, Silas." Her voice echoed, bouncing off the hard surfaces, making it impossible to pinpoint her location. "I'm just waiting for you to make a mistake." "I don't make mistakes." Silas moved down the aisle, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "Sterling pays me too well for that. He pays you to clean up his murders. How much is a dead marathon runner worth these days?" Silas rounded the corner of the final server rack. He saw her. She was standing at the far end of the room, near the reinforced glass windows. She looked terrible. Her face was pale, streaked with grease and sweat. The maintenance coveralls were stained dark with her own blood. Her left arm hung slightly unnatural by her side. Silas smiled, a grim, predatory thing. He raised his gun, aiming center mass. "More than you." He pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing happened. Silas frowned, tapping the magazine to clear a jam, and pulled the trigger again. Click. His eyes widened. He looked down at his weapon, then back up at Eliana. She hadn't flinched. She was holding something in her good hand. A heavy, industrial-grade electromagnet, stripped from the hospital's obsolete MRI storage bay 2 floors down. She had wired it directly into the server farm's massive 240-volt main power conduit. "You didn't notice the hum?" Eliana asked softly. Silas realized the vibrations beneath his feet weren't just the servers. The entire floor was vibrating. "I engaged the magnet 3 minutes ago," Eliana said. "It's pulling roughly 3 Teslas of magnetic force." enough to instantly magnetize and bind the firing pin in your weapon to the slide. Your gun is a paperweight. Silas dropped the useless firearm. He drew a serrated combat knife from his belt. Then we do this the hard way. He rushed her. He was fast, heavily muscled, and uninjured. Eliana didn't retreat. She stepped into his attack. As Silas thrust the knife toward her ribs, she pivoted sharply to the right. The blade sliced through the fabric of her coveralls, missing her skin by a fraction of an inch. She used his forward momentum against him. Her right hand, holding the surgical scalpel she had taken from the supply closet, flashed upward in a devastatingly precise arc. She didn't aim for a fatal blow. She aimed for mechanics. The scalpel sliced cleanly through the brachial artery and the bicep tendon of Silas's right arm. He roared in pain, dropping the knife as his arm became instantly useless, blood spraying across the glass window. He stumbled backward, clutching his arm, shock finally replacing the arrogance in his eyes. Eliana kicked his legs out from under him. He hit the floor hard. Before he could recover, she planted her heavy boot squarely on his chest, pinning him down. She placed the tip of the bloody scalpel directly over his jugular. Silas froze, panting heavily, looking up into eyes that held absolutely no mercy. "The police are going to be here in exactly 5 minutes," Eliana said, her voice a cold whisper. "I sent them an anonymous tip, along with all the Archangel data. You have a choice, Silas. You can bleed out on this floor in the next 60 seconds, or you can use your good hand to put pressure on that wound, stay alive, and testify against Ezra Sterling." Silas swallowed, staring at the blade. "He'll kill me. He has to survive me first," Eliana said. She removed her boot and stepped back. Silas immediately clamped his left hand over his ruined arm, groaning in agony. Eliana turned and walked out of the server room. The data was secure. The security chief was neutralized. It was time to find the CEO. Ezra Sterling didn't go to the server room. As soon as his private elevator passed the 8th floor, his phone lit up with an automated notification. Critical error. Master drive wipe initiated. External transfer complete. He stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in his wide, terrified eyes. The data was gone. His cover-up was completely, undeniably blown. The notification meant the police were likely already rolling toward the hospital, and the board of directors downstairs was currently calling the FBI. He hammered the button for the penthouse level. There was no saving the merger. There was no saving his career. The only thing left to save was himself. The elevator doors opened to the pristine, silent expanse of the executive suite. Ezra sprinted down the hallway, bursting through the double mahogany doors of his office. He scrambled behind his massive oak desk, his fingers trembling so violently he could barely punch the 6-digit code into the biometric wall safe hidden behind an abstract painting. Click. The heavy steel door swung open. Inside sat the contingencies of a man who always knew, deep down, that his ambition was built on a house of cards. Stacks of high-denomination Swiss bearer bonds, a thick leather envelope containing a pristine, forged Canadian passport, a burner phone, and a compact, matte black Glock 19 handgun. He had bought it off a private security contractor years ago. Unregistered, purely for peace of mind. He shoved the bonds and the passport into a leather satchel. He grabbed the Glock, checking the magazine with clumsy, unpracticed hands. A bullet was chambered. "Going somewhere, Ezra?" Ezra spun around, nearly dropping the weapon. Standing in the doorway of his office was Julian Hayes. The brilliant trauma surgeon was still wearing his blood-spotted scrubs from the ER downstairs. Julian looked utterly bewildered, his eyes darting from the open safe to the gun in Ezra's hand, and finally settling on Ezra's manic, sweating face. "Julian," Ezra said, trying to force his voice into its usual commanding register, though it cracked pathetically. "You shouldn't be up here. Go back downstairs." "Downstairs is a madhouse," Julian said, stepping fully into the room. His voice was thick with disbelief. The screens in the atrium, the entire Archangel file was just blasted to every phone in the building. It said you altered records. It said you killed Marcus Vance. Lies. Corporate sabotage, Ezra spat, zipping the satchel, a disgruntled employee trying to ruin the merger. It had Eliana's authorization code on the data dump, Julian countered, taking another step forward. The doctor was not an imposing man, but anger was beginning to override his confusion. "Where is she, Ezra? I tried her phone. I tried the ER. Nobody has seen her since you called her up here. Ezra's finger twitched on the trigger of the Glock. He felt a sudden, violent surge of hatred toward the man standing in front of him. Julian was everything Ezra wasn't: principled, beloved, genuinely dedicated to saving lives. She's gone, Julian. Ezra sneered, raising the gun slightly. She made a terrible miscalculation. Just like you're doing right now. Julian froze, staring at the barrel of the weapon. The reality of the situation crashed over him. The CEO of his hospital wasn't just corrupt. He was violently cornered. You killed her, Julian whispered, the color draining from his face. My God. You actually killed her. She brought it on herself. Ezra screamed, the final threads of his sanity snapping. He leveled the gun directly at Julian's chest. I built this hospital. I dragged it out of bankruptcy. I will not be caged like an animal because of some self-righteous nurse. Ezra grabbed his satchel, keeping the gun trained on the surgeon. You're coming with me to the helipad, Julian. They won't shoot if I have the chief of surgery with me. Before Julian could react, the heavy mahogany doors of the office swung open. Eliana stepped into the office. She looked like she had walked through a war zone. Because she had. Her dark hair had escaped its tight braid, falling in damp, unruly strands across her pale face. The blue maintenance coveralls were saturated with dark, drying blood. She favored her right side heavily, her left arm braced defensively against her ribs, but her eyes, those sharp, analyzing eyes, were as cold and steady as the deep ocean. Julian gasped. Eliana, you're alive. Ezra stumbled backward, hitting his desk. The color completely washed out of his face. It was as if a ghost had just walked into his sanctuary. How? I watched you fall. I watched you go over the edge. Gravity is predictable, Ezra, Eliana said, her voice low, raspy, but entirely calm. You aren't. That makes you easier to survive. Ezra panicked. He grabbed Julian by the collar of his scrubs, wrenching the doctor in front of him as a human shield, and jammed the barrel of the Glock hard against Julian's temple. Stay back, Ezra shrieked, his finger tightening on the trigger. I'll kill him. I swear to God I will blow his head off. Julian winced, closing his eyes tightly. Eliana stopped walking. She was exactly 20 feet away. The perfect distance. She didn't draw a weapon. She didn't rush him. She simply let her hands fall to her sides, open and empty. Look out the window, Ezra, Eliana said. Ezra didn't turn his head, keeping his manic gaze locked on Eliana, but his peripheral vision caught the flashing lights reflecting off the storm-battered glass. Down on the street, half a dozen black and white cruisers were screeching to a halt, boxing in the hospital entrances. The distinct wail of police sirens pierced the thick, soundproofed glass of the executive suite. They're setting up a perimeter, Eliana stated methodically. SWAT is 3 minutes behind them. They will secure the stairwells and lock down the elevators. The helipad is already grounded due to the storm. There is no flight out. There is no car waiting. The math has changed, Ezra. The equation equals 0. Shut up, Ezra roared. I have money. I have influence. You have a hostage, Eliana corrected him smoothly, which escalates this from white-collar fraud and attempted murder to a federal standoff. If you pull that trigger, the men coming up those stairs won't read you your rights. They will put a 308 round through the glass and into your brainstem. Ezra's hand shook violently. The gun rattled against Julian's skull. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his ruined, expensive suit. He was a creature of control, and he had absolutely none left. Let him go, Eliana said, taking one slow, deliberate step forward. Her voice shifted. The cold, tactical edge softened just a fraction, mimicking the tone she used to talk panicked junior nurses through a traumatic amputation. Julian has nothing to do with this. He saves lives. You and I, we know about taking them. This is between us. Ezra looked at her. He looked at the blood soaking her side. He realized she was unarmed. She was bleeding out. She was weak. In a fleeting moment of pure, egotistical delusion, Ezra thought he still had the upper hand. If he could just eliminate her, maybe he could spin a story. Maybe he could claim she took Julian hostage first. You're right, Ezra whispered. He shoved Julian violently to the floor. Julian scrambled backward, hitting the leather sofa. Ezra swung the gun away from the doctor and leveled it directly at Eliana's chest. He didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space of the office, but Eliana wasn't there. The moment Ezra's muscles tensed to shove Julian, Eliana's mind had already processed the sequence of events. Action is always faster than reaction, unless the reaction is preemptive. As the muzzle flashed, Eliana was already dropping her weight, diving forward and to the left. The 9mm hollow point bullet tore through the empty air where her center mass had been a fraction of a second prior, burying itself into the mahogany doorframe behind her. Pain exploded through Eliana's cracked ribs as she hit the carpet, but she didn't stop moving. She used her forward momentum to roll, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. Before Ezra could track her and pull the trigger a second time, Eliana was inside his guard. She didn't punch him. That risked breaking her hand and took too much energy. Instead, she used a devastatingly simple tactical disarm. Her right hand shot up in a palm strike, connecting brutally with the underside of Ezra's wrist, right on the median nerve. Ezra screamed, his hand involuntarily opening as the nerve strike sent a shockwave of numbness up his arm. The Glock clattered to the floor. Eliana pivoted, sweeping her right leg behind his knees. Ezra, off balance and reeling from the nerve strike, crashed backward onto the hard edge of his oak desk. The breath left his lungs in a violent whoosh. Eliana moved over him. She grabbed the lapels of his ruined Tom Ford suit, hauled him off the desk, and slammed him face first into the floor. She drove her knee hard into the small of his back, pinning him to the expensive carpet. She seized his right arm, wrenching it backward into a painful, inescapable joint lock. Ezra thrashed beneath her, sobbing, his face mashed into the fibers. "Get off me. Do you know who I am? You're a math problem," Eliana whispered into his ear, her voice devoid of exhaustion, devoid of anger. It was just the chilling sound of absolute finality. "And you've been solved." She reached into the pocket of her coveralls with her free hand, pulled out a thick, heavy-duty zip tie she had procured from the server room, and ruthlessly bound Ezra's wrists together behind his back. She stood up slowly. The adrenaline was finally beginning to crash. The edges of her vision blurred, black spots dancing in the corners. She swayed slightly, bracing her hand against the heavy desk to stay upright. Julian scrambled off the floor. He rushed past the groaning CEO and grabbed Eliana just as her knees began to buckle. "I've got you," Julian said frantically, easing her onto the leather sofa. He immediately began unzipping the bloody coveralls to assess the damage. He saw the angry, stapled laceration on her side and the massive bruising across her ribs. "Eliana, what did you do?" Eliana managed a weak, genuine smile. "Just a little triage, doctor." Heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway. The mahogany doors burst open, and 5 heavily armed SWAT officers flooded the room, assault rifles raised. "Police! Nobody move! Show me your hands!" the lead officer bellowed. Julian raised his hands immediately. "I'm Dr. Hayes. I'm the chief of surgery here. We need a medical team up here immediately." The officers swept the room. They saw the open safe. They saw the gun on the floor. They saw the hospital's CEO zip-tied and weeping on the carpet. And they saw the pale, blood-soaked woman on the couch. A detective in a tactical vest stepped into the room, lowering his weapon. He looked at Ezra, then looked at Eliana. He had seen the Archangel data drop. He knew exactly what had happened here tonight. "You, Eliana Davis?" the detective asked. Eliana nodded slowly. The detective holstered his weapon. He looked down at Ezra Sterling. "Get this piece of trash out of here," he ordered his men. As 2 officers hauled Ezra to his feet and dragged him out of his own office, Julian pressed a sterile gauze pad tight against Eliana's side. "You're going to be okay," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise you, El. I'm going to fix you up." Eliana looked out the shattered window, watching the storm finally begin to break, revealing the faint, quiet lights of the city she had just protected. "I know," she whispered, closing her eyes. "Take your time. Healing isn't always about bandages and medication. Sometimes it requires tearing down the infection at its absolute root." Eliana walked away from her past, hoping to leave the war behind, only to discover that the deepest battles are often fought not in trenches, but in the sterile, corrupt corridors of power where human lives are reduced to mere numbers on a balance sheet. True courage is standing as the shield between the vulnerable and the ambitious, no matter the personal cost. If this intense journey of survival, justice, and hidden strength kept you on the edge of your seat. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more thrilling stories. Leave a comment below. Did you predict Eliana's tactical takedown?